June heat pressed down on Warren County like a wool blanket someone forgot to remove. The kind of oppressive warmth that made black funeral dresses cling to skin and turned the inside of the First Methodist Church into a slow oven where grief and sweat mingled in equal measure. Catherine Walker stood 3 feet from her husband's casket, hands gripping the pew edge until her knuckles turned the color of bleached bone. Not from sorrow she had cried alone in the barn where Andrew had collapsed, where she had found him still warm, but already gone, his heart having decided 47 years was enough. This grip was calculation dressed in the costume of mourning. The mathematics of survival had no respect for tears. 160 acres of Iowa farmland, title clear, paid off in 1959 when she and Drew had made the final payment, and her father-in-law Kenneth had opened that bottle of whiskey saved since Prohibition. A Farmall Super M from 1951, 20 years old, now red paint, faded to the color of dried blood. A John Deere 60 from 1955, its two-cylinder engine still chugging along like a mechanical heartbeat. An operating loan of $2,400 due in September, 3 months away. $847 in the checking account at Farmers State Bank. The Reverend's voice droned something about dust and ashes, about the Lord giving and taking away. Kate let the words wash over her without landing her mind already 3 seasons ahead, calculating seed costs and fuel prices, and whether the Super M would last another planting season, or if something vital would finally give up like Drew's heart had given up. Behind her she could hear them. The whispers never stopped, even in church, even at a funeral. Especially at a funeral, poor Kate. What's she going to do now? Sell, obviously. A woman can't run a farm alone. It's not possible. Those kids are young. Maybe the boy will take over. Jonathan's 17. He doesn't know half of what Drew knew. Kenneth Clark's voice cut through the murmuring like a blade through butter. Kate's father-in-law stood beside her, 61 years old, and carrying himself like a man who had outlasted 3 financial panics and the Depression itself. His words held no comfort, just fact delivered clean. She'll do what Drew would have wanted. She'll try. The funeral reception happened in the church basement, where casseroles multiplied like a plague of good intentions. Kate accepted condolences with the same mechanical efficiency she used to check oil levels, nodding at each expression of sympathy, responding with the bare minimum required by social contract. She noticed who brought food and who brought empty platitudes. She noticed which men looked at her with pity and which looked at her like a problem that needed solving. She noticed Ronald Anderson standing near the coffee urn, watching her with the patient expression of a banker who had already calculated what her farm was worth and how soon she would need to sell it. Jonathan stood against the far wall, 17 and raw, with the kind of grief that came from losing a father before learning how to be a man. His hands stayed shoved deep in his suit jacket pockets, his jaw working through emotions he had no framework to process. Rachel, 15, and already showing the sharp intelligence that would carry her through veterinary school, moved through the crowd distributing plates and accepting hugs with a composure that broke Kate's heart more than tears would have. Kenneth found her in the kitchen, away from the crowd, where she was washing dishes that didn't need washing, just to have something to do with her hands. "You planning to sell?" The question came without preamble, without softness. Kenneth had never been soft, not even when his own son was being lowered into Iowa dirt. Kate kept scrubbing the same plate she had been scrubbing for 2 minutes. The answer should have been simple. Every logical pathway pointed toward, yes, sell the land, take the money, move to town, get a job that came with a regular paycheck and didn't depend on rain falling at the right time or machinery that was older than disco music. No. The word came out before she had fully decided, but once it was spoken, she felt its weight settle into truth. Kenneth nodded once, as if he had expected nothing less and nothing more. Then you better learn fast, because trying is good, but succeeding requires more than good intentions. He walked away, leaving Kate alone with clean dishes and a decision that would define the next decade of her life. Through the kitchen window, she could see the cemetery where Drew was now part of the same soil he had worked for 25 years. The math was still there, still waiting, still demanding answers that had nothing to do with love or loss or the proper way to grieve. Winter came early that year, as if the weather itself wanted to test Kate's resolve before spring planting could even begin. By December, 6 months after the funeral, the farm had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely foreign. She rose before dawn because the work demanded it. She fed cattle because they needed feeding. She maintained equipment because machinery that broke in April stayed broken through planting season. She balanced books at the kitchen table each night, running numbers that never quite added up the way she needed them to. The letter from Farmers State Bank arrived on a Tuesday, formal and cold as the December wind that rattled the farmhouse windows. Ronald Anderson requested her presence at his earliest convenience to discuss her financial situation. The words were polite, but Kate had lived in farm country long enough to know that when a banker used the phrase earliest convenience, he meant now. The bank occupied the corner lot on Main Street, 2 stories of brick and marble that Ronald's father had built in 1927, right before the world fell apart, and took half the farmers in 3 counties with it. The lobby still carried that Depression-era grandeur, all polished floors and hushed voices, the kind of space designed to make you feel small before you ever sat down to discuss money you didn't have. Ronald Anderson's office smelled of leather and pipe tobacco and the particular confidence that came from controlling most of the agricultural credit in Warren County. He stood when Kate entered, extending a hand across a mahogany desk that probably cost more than her truck. 61 years old, every gray hair perfectly in place, suit pressed sharp enough to cut bread. "Mrs. Walker, thank you for coming in. Please sit." Kate sat. The leather chair was too comfortable, designed to make you relax before they delivered bad news. She kept her spine straight, hands folded in her lap, and waited. Ronald opened a folder, her folder she realized with her name typed on the tab, and what looked like 6 months of account history spread across his desk like evidence at a trial. "I've reviewed your husband's accounts. You're current on the operating loan, which is admirable given the circumstances." The pause that followed was designed to let her feel pride before he took it away. Kate said nothing, letting silence do the work of forcing him to continue. "But winter's coming. Equipment needs maintenance. You'll need seed for spring." And frankly, his finger traced a line down one of the pages. "Your income last year barely covered expenses. We managed. Managed isn't thriving, Mrs. Walker. Let me be direct. I have 3 serious buyers for your land. $600 an acre. That's $96,000. You could pay off the loan keep, maybe $93,000. Invest conservatively, live comfortably for many years." The number hung in the air between them like smoke. $93,000, More money than Drew had earned in 20 years of dawn-to-dark farming, of machinery breakdowns, and hail damage and commodity prices that swung wild as a drunk driver on a gravel road. Enough money to give Jonathan a real start, enough to put Rachel through college without worrying about scholarships, enough to stop calculating and start living. Or Ronald leaned forward, his expression shifting to something meant to look helpful, but landing closer to predatory if you want to keep farming. We could structure a loan. New equipment, hire a man to handle the heavy work, someone with experience to help manage the operation. My son-in-law, Christopher Martinez, for instance, he's looking to expand. You'd keep ownership. He'd manage day-to-day split profits, 60-40, 60 for him. Ronald's smile never wavered. He'd be doing the work, Mrs. Walker, the physical labor, the decision-making. You'd maintain ownership and receive steady income without the burden of running everything yourself. Kate stood. The conversation was over whether Ronald knew it yet or not. "I'll think about it." Walking out, she heard him mutter something to his secretary about giving her until spring, about how widows always came back once reality set in. The words followed her onto Main Street, where December wind cut through her coat and made her eyes water. Or maybe that was something else entirely. The attic had accumulated 2 decades of married life boxes stacked in corners where summer heat turned everything to dust and winter cold made the floorboards creak. Kate had avoided this space since the funeral, knowing that sorting through Drew's things would require an emotional fortitude she hadn't yet mustered. But she needed the old tax records needed to understand exactly what their financial position had been over the years, needed numbers to anchor herself when everything else felt like it was sliding sideways. The box sat in the far corner, water-stained cardboard with Drew's handwriting across the side. Farm Records 1950 to 1960. She pulled it into the light, filtering through the attic's single window, and began sorting through yellowed papers that smelled of mildew and time. The bank statement stopped her cold. Farmers State Bank dated March 1953. Kenneth Clark's name printed across the top. Loan amount $5,000. In 1953, that was a fortune. The kind of money that could save a farm or sink it, depending on which way the wind blew. She found more. Payment records showing monthly installment interest calculations, notes about refinancing. The loan had taken 13 years to pay off, finally clearing in 1966. Drew had never mentioned it. Kenneth certainly hadn't. That evening, Kate confronted him on the front porch, where he sat smoking his pipe and watching winter sunset turn the western sky the color of a bruise. Kenneth's face didn't change when she laid the bank statements on the small table between them, but something in his shoulders shifted like a man settling into discomfort he'd been expecting for years. "You borrowed money, you who taught Drew to never carry debt." Kenneth took another pull from his pipe, letting smoke drift into cold air before answering. "I did. $5,000 in 1953 for farm expansion. Everyone said it was smart. Commodity prices were climbing, land values going up. Seemed like the right move. What happened? 58 happened. Corn prices crashed. Suddenly, I owed money I couldn't pay, working 3 jobs just to make interest payments. Your mother-in-law left me because of it. Couldn't handle the stress, the uncertainty, the constant fear that we'd lose everything. Drew never told me, because I told him one thing and one thing only: don't make my mistakes. He listened. I hope you will too." Kate stared at the bank statements, at the numbers that had nearly destroyed Kenneth's marriage and farm and life. What mistake? Borrowing the money or almost losing the farm? Both. The borrowing put me in position to lose. The losing taught me what matters. But I wouldn't wish that education on anyone. The cold had seeped through her coat, settling into bones that already ached from morning chores and afternoon equipment maintenance. Kate gathered the statements and stood. I won't borrow then. Kenneth nodded, but his eyes held something darker than approval. Just remember, not borrowing means not failing, but it also means not having room to fail. You make one mistake, there's no cushion. The words followed her inside, where she spread the statements across the kitchen table and calculated what 13 years of debt had cost Kenneth. Not just in dollars, though those were substantial. In relationships, in sleep, in the kind of constant low-grade terror that debt created, where every drought and every equipment breakdown and every market downturn became an existential threat instead of just another problem to solve. She thought about Ronald Anderson's offer, $93,000 clean and simple. She thought about Christopher Martinez taking over operations, splitting profits, making decisions. She thought about Kenneth's ex-wife, a woman Kate had never met, but whose ghost lived in those bank statements, a marriage that hadn't survived the weight of $5,000 borrowed at the wrong time. The coffee shop on Main Street served as Warren County's unofficial information exchange, a place where farmers gathered before sunrise to discuss weather and commodity prices and whose daughter was dating whose son. Kate started going in late 1971, partly for the coffee that was always burnt, but strong, partly to hear what people were saying about her, partly because isolation would kill her faster than any drought. The story of Jennifer Williams lived in those conversations like a cautionary tale the old men told to scare the young ones straight. Jennifer's husband had died in 1968, left her with 300 acres and a choice. She'd decided to keep farming, borrowed $15,000 to modernize new tractor, new planter, new everything. The equipment had broken down in ways the dealer swore were impossible. Costs spiraled. One bad harvest became two. By 1970, the bank owned her farm, and Jennifer Williams worked in the elementary school cafeteria serving chicken nuggets to children who used to call her Mrs. Williams when she was somebody who mattered. Kate learned this story in pieces overheard in coffee shop conversations where men used Jennifer's name as a verb. Don't pull a Williams. Don't Williams yourself into bankruptcy. The casual cruelty of it settled into Kate's understanding like sediment in a pond, showing her exactly how the community would treat her if she failed. She found Jennifer at the elementary school during lunch hour, a woman in her early 50s wearing a hairnet and the kind of exhausted expression that came from dreams dying in public. The cafeteria smelled of industrial food and bleach and broken expectations. Mrs. Williams, I'm Kate Walker. I heard about your farm. Jennifer's face closed immediately, defenses rising like shields. Come to gawk, to learn. What would you have done different? The question hung between them while children's voices echoed off tile walls and steam rose from industrial warming trays. Jennifer's hands stopped their automatic motion of ladling mashed potatoes onto plastic trays. She looked at Kate for a long moment, measuring something before answering. I would have stayed small. Everyone told me bigger meant safer. Modern equipment, economies of scale, all that. Turned out bigger just meant more ways to fail and more money to lose when you did. Kate absorbed this, adding it to the growing catalog of lessons learned from other people's mistakes. Jennifer returned to serving lunch, and Kate walked back to her truck, understanding that she was standing at the same crossroads Jennifer had faced, except now she had Jennifer's story as a map of where not to go. March 1972 brought the first hints of spring, that particular Iowa mix of mud and hope, where you could almost believe winter was over even though April would prove you wrong. Kate needed hydraulic parts for the Super M, a seal kit that cost $18, but would prevent a $200 repair if she caught it now. The International Harvester dealership sat on the edge of town, surrounded by new tractors that gleamed under weak spring sun like promises no one could afford to keep. Christopher Martinez stood at the parts counter collecting a brochure for the new IH 1066. 36-years-old farmer's son carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had never known real failure. He'd inherited 400 acres from his father, and apparently spent his free time figuring out how to turn 400 into 800. Kate had seen him at church at community events, always with his wife Pamela on his arm like a trophy he'd won and wanted everyone to notice. Mrs. Walker. His smile hit somewhere between salesman and sympathetic, that particular expression men used when they wanted to seem helpful while secretly calculating how your misfortune might benefit them. Sorry about Drew. He was good people. Kate accepted the condolence with a nod, turning her attention to the parts clerk who had appeared behind the counter. Christopher didn't move, seemed to be waiting for something more. You still planning to farm that place yourself? The directness surprised her. Most people danced around the question, wrapped it in concern and false sympathy. Christopher just asked it straight, like he was inquiring about the weather. I am. He nodded toward the IH 1066 brochure. In his hands, glossy paper showing a tractor that cost more than most people's houses. If you ever want to upgrade, I could put in a word with Ronald. Family discount. I'll manage with what I have. Suit yourself. His tone shifted, not unkind, but factual, like he was simply stating weather patterns. But that Super M is what 20-years-old parts are getting scarce. One major breakdown, and you're dead in the water during planting season. Can't afford that kind of delay. The words landed clean and true, which somehow made them worse than if he'd been cruel. Kate collected her seal kit, paid her $18.40, and left Christopher standing there with his brochure and his certainty that modern equipment solved problems old iron created. Easter Sunday, 1972, brought the whole county to First Methodist families dressed in their seasonal best, children squirming through services that felt endless when spring weather beckoned outside. The social hour afterward happened in the church basement, that familiar space where coffee ran weak and cookies multiplied through some miracle of church lady coordination. Kate had learned to position herself near the back wall, close enough to participate, but far enough to escape when necessary. Pamela Martinez approached alone, which was unusual. Ronald Anderson's daughter, 36 years old, always perfectly dressed in ways that made other women feel underdressed, even when they'd tried their best. But something in her expression seemed softer than Kate expected, less performance and more genuine. Kate, I wanted to say what you're doing is brave. Kate waited for the inevitable, but that would follow. The qualifier that turned compliments into criticisms. I mean it. When my mother died, I couldn't imagine running the household alone. My father handled everything, But farming? That takes real courage. Or stupidity. Pamela laughed, and the sound carried something genuine, unguarded. Maybe both. Listen, I know Christopher came across as pushy at the dealership. He means well, he's just ambitious. Sometimes he forgets not everyone wants to expand at his pace. For the first time, Kate saw past the banker's daughter, the farmer's wife, the woman who seemed to glide through life on money and privilege. She saw someone who might understand what it meant to feel trapped by expectations. Does he ever talk about anything except farming? Pamela's smile faltered just for a moment, but long enough for Kate to catch it. Not really. Some nights I wonder if he'd notice if I disappeared, as long as someone kept the books balanced and looked good at community events. The vulnerability hung between them, unexpected and raw. Then Pamela's mask slid back into place, smooth and practiced as a well-rehearsed lie. Anyway, if you ever need anything, and I mean this, call me. Woman to woman, Kate believed her sort of. The kind of partial belief you gave to people who meant well, but had never been tested, who offered help from a position of comfort without understanding what actual need felt like. By late 1972, the coffee shop conversations had shifted tone. The older farmers who remembered the Depression still talked about weather and soil conditions, but the younger ones, men in their 30s and 40s, who had only known prosperity, spoke a different language. Leverage, futures markets, expansion opportunities. The words themselves seemed to carry a fever as something infectious that spread through coffee and optimism until caution started sounding like cowardice. Commodity prices were climbing. Corn that had been $1.80 per bushel in 1971 pushed past $2, then $2.20. Land values followed dirt that sold for $500 an acre, suddenly bringing $650–700. The Russian grain deal was still just rumors, but rumors had a way of becoming prophecy when enough people believed them hard enough. Gary Thompson announced he'd borrowed $50,000 against his land, bought another 200 acres. Larry Young followed with his own expansion plans. The bank was practically begging them to borrow, they said. Interest rates were reasonable. Prices were climbing. This was the time to build something real, something that would set up the next generation. Kate sat in her usual corner, drinking burnt coffee and watching the fever spread. Nobody asked her opinion, which was fine. She had learned that silence was its own kind of armor, that not participating in the excitement meant not having to defend yourself when people questioned why you weren't as brave or smart or forward-thinking as everyone else. The mathematics of her survival remained simple and brutal. 160 acres, equipment that was old but functional, operating costs that she could cover with modest yields and modest prices, no debt except the seasonal operating loan that she paid off each December before the year turned, no cushion, but no noose either. August 1972 arrived with heat that made the afternoon shimmer and turned fieldwork into a test of endurance. Kate was mending fence when Jonathan brought the mail, his face carrying that particular teenage mix of confusion and concern that meant trouble had arrived in an official envelope. The letter was from Farmers State Bank, formal and brief. Dear Mrs. Walker, due to administrative review, your operating loan account number 47829 is hereby called for full payment. Amount due $2,417.63. Payment required by September 15, 1972. Kate read it twice, then a third time, looking for some explanation that wasn't there. The loan wasn't due until December. She'd made every payment on time, sometimes early. Her account was current, her credit perfect. This made no sense. She drove to town immediately, the letter clutched in her hand, like evidence of a crime she hadn't committed. The bank clerk, who'd always been friendly, suddenly couldn't meet her eyes, shuffling papers and looking anywhere except at Kate's face. There must be a mistake. The loan isn't due until December. The clerk's voice came out thin and apologetic. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Walker. Mr. Anderson flagged your account for review. Board policy? Female-operated farms are considered higher risk. They voted to call in loans that don't have male co-signers." The words landed like a physical blow. "That's not legal. It's bank policy. If you can provide a male co-signer, we can extend the loan under the original terms. Otherwise, full payment is required by September 15th. Kate felt something cold settle in her chest, a fury so complete it became calm. "I'll pay it off," the clerk blinked. "The full amount, by September 15th. The mathematics of it consumed the next week. $2,417.63. Kate had $847 in savings. She needed to find $1,570 more, and she needed to find it in ways that didn't involve asking Ronald Anderson for anything. She sold 15 head of cattle animals she'd planned to breed, getting $1,800 from a buyer in the next county who didn't ask questions about why she was selling. The money felt dirty in her hands, like she was sacrificing the farm's future to survive its present. She borrowed $300 from Kenneth, who gave it without questions or judgment, but with eyes that said he understood exactly what this cost. She took the last $317 from savings, watching her account balance drop to $530. On September 14th, she walked into Farmers State Bank with a check for $2,417.63. The clerk processed it in silence, stamping papers with the mechanical efficiency of someone who wanted this transaction finished. Kate walked out with a receipt and the hollow understanding that she'd just spent her children's future to prove a point to a banker who would never care and might not even remember. Kenneth was waiting on the porch when she got home, smoking his pipe and watching sunset turn the fields golden. Kate sat beside him, exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical labor. "You just spent everything to prove you're right. I proved I don't need them." Kenneth's expression hardened in ways she'd rarely seen. "No, you proved you can't afford to be wrong even once. Every penny you had is gone, Kate. You have $500 between you and disaster. What happens when the Super M breaks down? When you need seed for spring, when anything goes wrong, because something always goes wrong, what should I have done? Let them force me into a male co-signer, maybe. Or maybe sold those cattle next month when you actually needed money instead of when you needed pride." Kenneth's pipe had gone out, but he didn't bother relighting it. "Fair doesn't plant corn," your grandmother used to say. "Being right and being broke feel about the same when you're hungry." You remember that. Kate did remember. She would be hungry before she'd be wrong, before she'd give Ronald Anderson the satisfaction of watching her crawl back asking for help on his terms. The resolve settled into her bones, like calcium hardening into something that would either save her or destroy her, and right now she couldn't tell which. Fall brought Rachel home from school, carrying secrets that Kate spotted immediately in the way her daughter moved, careful and deliberate, like someone trying not to disturb something fragile. The confession came over dishes one October evening, Rachel's hands busy with soap and water, while her voice stayed carefully neutral. "I've been seeing someone. Brandon Martinez." Kate's hands stopped their automatic motion of drying plates. Christopher and Pamela's oldest son, 18 years old, supposedly headed to Iowa State for agricultural business, the kind of boy who drove nice trucks and came from families who ate dinner at country clubs. How long since September? "We met at the library. He's different than his parents' mom. He wants to study environmental science, not business. Talks about sustainable farming, crop rotation, soil health. He doesn't want to build an empire like his dad." "What does Jonathan think?" Rachel's jaw tightened. "Jonathan caught us at the Dairy Queen last week. He's not happy." The understatement landed with all the weight Rachel had avoided putting on it. Kate could imagine Jonathan's reaction, perfectly protective and angry, and convinced that any Martinez would eventually break his sister's heart, because that's what people with money did to people without it. "Does Brandon treat you well?" "Yes." "Does he respect you more than most boys do?" Kate considered this while drying the same plate she'd been drying for 2 minutes. The smart thing would be to forbid it to protect Rachel from the inevitable moment when Brandon's parents discovered their son was dating the widow's daughter and made it clear that was unacceptable. But Kate had learned that forbidding things rarely worked and always cost more than it gained. "Then I won't stop you." But Rachel, her voice held the weight of experience earned through loss. "His family won't approve. When things get hard, and they will, you need to know if he's strong enough to choose you over them." Rachel nodded, relief and uncertainty mixing in her expression. Kate returned to dishes, understanding that she'd just given permission for her daughter to learn a lesson that could only be taught through heartbreak. Easter 1973 arrived with the kind of false spring that made you believe winter was truly over before April reminded you otherwise. The church bulletin board carried an announcement that Christopher Martinez had probably paid to make prominent Martinez family farms announce his expansion. Acquired Peterson 200-acre parcel. Total operation now 600 acres. New equipment, IH 1066 6-row planter, partnering with Farmers State Bank for agricultural excellence. The photograph showed Christopher and Pamela cutting a ribbon on a new grain bin, Ronald Anderson standing beside them with the expression of a man who just made a profitable investment. The whole display screamed success in ways designed to make everyone else feel small. Kate studied the announcement while church emptied around her. 600 acres. That was nearly 4 times her operation. The IH 1066 that Christopher had been browsing brochures for last year, he'd actually bought it. The kind of money required for this expansion made her modest operating loan look like pocket change. Kenneth appeared at her elbow, reading over her shoulder. "They're betting prices stay high." "Might be right. And if they're wrong, then we'll see a lot of farm sales in about 5 years. The certainty in his voice unsettled Kate more than uncertainty would have. Kenneth had lived through enough cycles to recognize patterns most people missed, to see beyond the current moment's optimism into the mathematical inevitability that followed. April brought actual spring mud and rain and the desperate rush to get seed in the ground before the window closed. Kate worked dawn to dark running the Super M until her bones vibrated from the tractor's rhythm, until diesel fumes and turned earth became the only smells she knew. Kenneth helped when his age allowed Jonathan after school, but mostly it was Kate, alone on the tractor seat, watching rows unfurl behind her and calculating whether this planting would be enough. The worn two-cylinder engine made its distinctive sound, that unmistakable Johnny Popper rhythm that every farmer in Iowa could identify from half a mile away. 22 years old and still running, still reliable, still doing the work it was built to do. Kate's hands knew every quirk of its operation, the exact way to set the choke on cold mornings, the particular groan the transmission made, shifting from fourth to fifth, the sweet spot in the throttle where fuel economy balanced against productivity. She'd bought a used John Deere 730 over winter, $2,200 cash saved from harvest profits. The dealer had seemed surprised when she paid without financing, like the concept of buying equipment outright was foreign and possibly stupid. But the 730 gave her backup, meant she wasn't completely dependent on the Super M's continued function, meant she had options if something major broke. The mathematics of her operation remained simple in ways Christopher Martinez's accountant probably couldn't comprehend. 160 acres, corn and soybeans in rotation, modest yields at modest prices, generating modest profits, operating costs low enough that she could survive years when others failed. No debt except seasonal operating loans paid off same year. Every penny saved went into an account that was slowly rebuilding toward $5,000, a number that felt simultaneously huge and completely inadequate. Kenneth found her in the machine shed one evening in early May, standing beside the Super M with one hand resting on its faded hood. The metal was cool now, the day's heat having bled away into Iowa dusk. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway smoking his pipe and watching his daughter-in-law contemplate a tractor that was older than her marriage had been. Martinez just doubled down. You could do the same, you know. Borrow $30,000, buy the Henderson 80 acres while it's still available. Prices are climbing. Land you buy today for $1,500 an acre might be worth $3,000 in 5 years. Kate's hand stayed on the Super M's hood. No. Prices are good right now. No. Her voice came out flat, absolute, the kind of no that didn't invite discussion. I won't bet the farm on prices staying good. I'll bet on me being able to survive when they don't. What if they never drop? What if Christopher's right, and this really is different? Then I'll be the fool who stayed small while everyone else got rich. But I'll be a fool who sleeps at night without wondering if the bank will take everything I own. Kenneth nodded slowly, smoke drifting from his pipe into twilight. Drew would have said the same thing. Drew's dead. This is my decision now. The words came out harsher than she intended, but Kenneth just smiled slightly like she'd passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. That's what I'm counting on. May stretched into June, planting completed early growth, showing green against dark soil. Kate stood in her north field one evening, corn 6 inches high and looking healthy, and allowed herself the dangerous emotion of hope. Not optimism exactly. She'd learned optimism was for people who could afford to be wrong. Just hope. The modest kind. The kind that said, maybe this year would be okay. Maybe the weather would cooperate. Maybe prices would hold. Maybe all the careful calculations would add up to survival. The Super M sat at field's edge, engine ticking as it cooled, red paint faded, until primer showed through in patches where weather had won small battles. 22 years old, older than her son. A machine that by all rights should have been replaced years ago, that every modern farmer would call obsolete, that Christopher Martinez would probably laugh at if he saw it. But it was paid for. Every bolt, every seal, every piece of worn metal belonged to Kate Walker and no one else. The bank had no claim on it. Ronald Anderson's signature appeared nowhere on its title. When she started it tomorrow morning, when its two-cylinder engine coughed it to life and settled into that familiar rhythm, it would work for her without demanding payments or threatening foreclosure or caring whether she was male or female or foolish enough to think a widow could farm alone. She ran her hand along the hood one more time before heading to the house. Jonathan's truck was in the driveway, meaning he was home from his part-time job at the feed mill. Rachel's bicycle leaned against the porch, meaning she'd finished whatever after-school activity currently consumed her time. Kenneth's old Ford sat near the barn, meaning he'd stayed late, checking on things the way he always did, the way he'd probably keep doing until something vital failed in his body, the same way it had failed in Drew's. The kitchen smelled of the roast she'd put in the oven that morning, potatoes and carrots, making the house feel lived in instead of just inhabited. Jonathan sat at the table, doing homework, or pretending to his attention divided between algebra and whatever thoughts occupied a 19-year-old's mind. Rachel was setting plates with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done this task 10,000 times. Kenneth arrived last, settling into his chair with the careful movement of someone whose joints had started keeping a ledger of 70 years of hard use. They said grace. Kate still maintained that ritual, even though her faith had taken substantial damage the day she'd found Drew cold in the barn and passed food in comfortable silence. The conversation that followed was mundane, forgettable, the kind of dinner table talk that families had everywhere. But underneath it, Kate felt something settling, something she couldn't quite name. Not peace, exactly, not happiness. Just a sense that they were still here, still together, still functioning, despite everything that had tried to break them. Jonathan cleared his throat the way he always did when he was working up courage to say something difficult. "Mom, people at the mill are laughing at us." Kate set down her fork. "What are they saying? That you're farming with junk, that the Super M belongs in a museum, that you're too stubborn or too stupid to understand that farming's changed." Rachel's jaw tightened. "People are assholes, Jonathan." Kenneth's voice cut through the tension. "Language, girl, but she's not wrong." Kate looked at her son, really looked at him. 19 years old and already carrying the weight of other people's judgment, other people's certainty that Kate was doing everything wrong. "You believe them," Jonathan's struggle played across his face. Loyalty warring with doubt. "I don't know. I see Christopher Martinez with his new equipment farming 3 times what we farm. I see other guys our age who can afford trucks and dates and normal lives. Then I come home and we're barely scraping by with machinery from the Eisenhower administration. We're not scraping by. We're surviving. What's the difference?" "The difference is survival means we still own this land. The Martinezes own 600 acres on paper, but the bank owns it in reality. They're renting it from Farmers State Bank at variable interest rates they think they can afford right now. When something changes, and something always changes, the bank will take it all back." Kenneth nodded. "Your mother's playing a different game than Christopher Martinez. He's playing who can grow fastest. She's playing who can still be standing when the music stops." When does the music stop? Jonathan's question carried the weight of someone who'd been patient long enough. When prices drop, when drought hits, when interest rates rise, when any of 1,000 things that can go wrong actually go wrong. Kate met her son's eyes, across the table. Maybe never. Maybe Christopher's right, and this time really is different. Maybe I'm the fool who missed the opportunity of a lifetime because I was too scared to take risks. But I can live with being a fool if it means you and Rachel inherit land instead of debt. The answer seemed to satisfy him, or at least silence him. They finished dinner in quiet, and Kate washed dishes while Rachel dried, and Jonathan took out garbage, and Kenneth settled into his chair on the porch for his evening pipe. The routine of it felt both comforting and terrifying, this sense that she was building something fragile that could shatter with one wrong move, one bad decision, one piece of machinery failing at exactly the wrong moment. That night, Kate sat at the kitchen table, running numbers the way she did every night, calculating and recalculating until the mathematics became meditation. 160 acres, yielding 120 bushels per acre at $2.40 per bushel, meant gross income of roughly $46,000. Operating costs of approximately $28,000 left. $18,000 profit if everything went perfectly, which it never did. Equipment maintenance, unexpected repairs, the operating loan, interest, all of it chipped away until that $18,000 became 12 or 10 or 8, depending on what broke and when. She was building savings again, slowly. 530 had become 800, then 1,200, now approaching 2,000. In 5 years, if nothing catastrophic happened, she might have 15,000 saved. In 10 years, maybe 25 or 30. Numbers that felt huge and tiny, simultaneously enough to survive most disasters, but not enough to expand or modernize or do any of the things everyone said she needed to do to stay competitive. The question Kenneth had asked haunted her. What if they never drop? What if Christopher Martinez rode this wave of high prices and easy credit all the way to building a real agricultural empire? What if caution was just another word for cowardice, and she spent the next decade proving she could survive small, while everyone else proved they could succeed big? She couldn't know. That was the hardest part. The future refused to reveal itself, offering only the present moment's decision and the hope that careful choices compounded into eventual safety. Kate Walker made her choice that night, the same way she made it every night. She would stay small, stay careful, stay free of debt. She would farm with old equipment that still worked. She would calculate conservatively and save aggressively and sleep at night without wondering if next month's payment would sink her. People would call her foolish. They already did. They would say she was too scared to succeed, too timid to grab opportunity when it presented itself. They would use her name the way they used Jennifer Williams's name, as a cautionary tale about what happened when you thought you could farm without embracing modern methods and modern debt. But standing there in her kitchen at midnight, account ledger spread across the table, showing savings of $1,973, Kate Walker made peace with being foolish. Because foolish people who stayed small sometimes survived the storms that drowned the ambitious. And survival, she was learning, counted for more than anyone wanted to admit, until survival became the only thing that mattered. Spring, 1973, gave way to summer, and summer burned itself into fall, while commodity markets climbed in ways that made the coffee shop conversations shift from cautious optimism to outright fever. Corn pushed past $2.50 per bushel by harvest, then $2.70, approaching $3 by year's end. Soybeans followed the same trajectory, dragging land values upward like a tide that everyone swore would never recede. Kate harvested her 160 acres with the same methodical care she applied to everything, watching yields come in at a respectable 115 bushels per acre. The mathematics worked out to roughly $20,000 gross after all costs were settled. She paid off her operating loan in November, 2 months early, and deposited $8,000 into savings. The account balance climbed past $10,000 for the first time since Drew's death, a number that should have felt like security, but mostly felt like a very small buffer against very large unknowns. Christopher Martinez harvested 600 acres that same fall. His new IH-1066 pulling equipment Kate couldn't afford to look at too closely. The coffee shop buzzed with numbers, gross income estimates, debt-to-asset ratios, expansion projections. Christopher bought drinks for anyone who'd listened to his theories about the new agricultural economy, about how the old ways of thinking were obsolete, about how leverage was the only path to real wealth. 1974 arrived with headlines about Russian grain deals and global food shortages, and suddenly $3 corn became $3.50. Land that had been worth $700 per acre pushed toward $900, then $1,000. Banks fell over themselves, offering credit to farmers who 6 months earlier they'd considered risky. The word on everyone's lips was opportunity, spoken like a prayer and believed like gospel. Kate attended a Farm Bureau meeting in February, where a guest speaker from Iowa State explained the new economics of agriculture. Economies of scale, he called it. The future belonged to operations that could spread fixed costs across maximum acreage, that could leverage modern equipment and scientific management techniques. The speaker used charts and graphs and 5-year projections that all pointed in one direction: get bigger or get out. During the question period, someone asked about farmers who chose to stay small. The speaker smiled, the kind of patient expression teachers used with slow students. Those operations will become anachronisms. They'll survive for now, riding the current wave, but they won't thrive. When markets eventually normalize, they'll lack the efficiency to compete. Kate left before the meeting ended, driving home through February darkness, while the speaker's words echoed in her mind. Anachronism, a thing belonging to another time, surviving past its expiration date through inertia rather than relevance. That's what she was building: a farm from the past, maintained through stubbornness in a world that had moved on. By spring 1974, Christopher Martinez announced his next expansion. Another 300 acres, bringing his total to 900. New equipment to match a bigger planter, a second tractor grain storage facilities that rose behind his machine shed like monuments to ambition. The local paper ran a profile piece complete with photographs of Christopher standing in front of his operation arm, crossed expression confident. The article called him a visionary young farmer and the future of Iowa agriculture. Kate read the article at her kitchen table while morning coffee went cold in her cup. The math was there in black and white: 900 acres, generating approximately 90,000 bushels of corn at $3.50 per bushel, meant gross income of over $300,000. Even accounting for operating costs and debt service, Christopher was probably netting 6 figures annually, more money than Drew had made in his entire farming career, more money than Kate could imagine accumulating in a lifetime of careful savings. She folded the newspaper and returned to her own calculations. 160 acres, modest yields, conservative estimates. Her operation would gross maybe 30,000 this year if prices held and weather cooperated. After costs, she'd be lucky to clear 12,000. She'd deposit what she could into savings, maintain equipment pay bills, and start over next year doing exactly the same thing. Kenneth found her still sitting there an hour later, coffee cold and untouched, staring at numbers that refused to add up to anything resembling the future everyone else was building. Comparing yourself to Martinez won't help. I'm not comparing. I'm calculating. Same thing. Kenneth poured himself coffee from the pot Kate had made at dawn. He's playing a different game with different rules. You can't win his game, so stop measuring yourself against his scorecard. What if his game is the only one that matters? The question hung between them, honest and raw. Kenneth sat down across from her, wrapping weathered hands around his coffee mug. Then we'll find out in about 5 years whether leverage beats caution or caution beats leverage. Until then, you keep doing what makes sense to you, and he keeps doing what makes sense to him, and we all pretend we know how this story ends. County fair season brought Christopher and Pamela Martinez to every public event, their presence somehow larger than just two people. Pamela wore clothes that cost more than Kate spent on groceries. In 6 months, her jewelry catching sunlight in ways designed to make you notice. But Kate had started paying attention to different details, the way Pamela's smile never quite reached her eyes, how her laugh came half a beat too late, like she was remembering to perform happiness rather than actually feeling it. The church social in May 1975 happened on one of those perfect spring afternoons when Iowa briefly forgot it was capable of brutality. Kate was helping set up tables when Pamela approached, this time without the usual audience of admirers. Something in her posture suggested this wasn't a social call. Can we talk somewhere private? They walked to the cemetery behind the church, far enough from the crowd that voices became distant murmurs. Pamela's hands twisted together, destroying the perfect composition she usually maintained. Christopher wants to borrow another 150,000. Buy the old Henderson place, 400 acres. It would put us over $1 million in total debt. The number was so large Kate almost couldn't process it. $1 million. The kind of debt that could bury 3 generations if anything went wrong. What does your father think? Daddy thinks it's brilliant. Says leverage is how fortunes are built, how families establish dynasties. Pamela's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. But I see the bills. I know what we owe. And I'm terrified. The vulnerability was complete and unexpected, like watching someone's mask crack and fall away, to reveal nothing but fear underneath. Kate waited, understanding that Pamela needed to speak more than she needed answers. What does Christopher say when you tell him you're scared? I don't tell him. If I did, he'd think I'm weak, that I don't believe in what we're building. Pamela looked directly at Kate for the first time, and what Kate saw there wasn't the banker's daughter, or the farmer's wife, or the woman who seemed to glide through life on privilege. Just someone drowning slowly in water everyone else thought was champagne. You want my advice? Yes, don't borrow the money. Pamela's laugh came out bitter and broken. I can't tell Christopher that. He'd ask why I'm discussing our finances with you of all people. He doesn't know I talk to you, doesn't know I'm scared. Then you need to tell him. I can't. Pamela's mask was sliding back into place, even as tears threatened to destroy her makeup. My whole life, I was Ronald Anderson's daughter. Then I became Christopher Martinez's wife. I've never been just me, and now we're building this empire, and I don't know if it's what I want or what I'm supposed to want. The admission hung between them raw and honest in ways that made Kate's earlier judgments of Pamela feel cruel. This woman wasn't an enemy. She was a prisoner of expectations she'd never questioned until the cage was locked and she'd lost the key. You could tell him no, make him choose between the expansion and your peace of mind. We both know which he'd choose. Pamela wiped carefully at her eyes, trying to preserve what remained of her composure. Thank you for listening. I shouldn't have bothered you with this. She walked away before Kate could respond, leaving Kate standing among gravestones, understanding that Pamela's cruelty, the subtle digs at church, the condescending comments about Kate's equipment came from envy rather than contempt. Pamela looked at Kate and saw freedom. The freedom to fail on your own terms. The freedom to make choices without consulting bankers and husbands and fathers who all had opinions about what you should want. Christopher bought the Henderson place that summer. 1,400 acres total, now an operation that dwarfed anything else in Warren County. The coffee shop conversations shifted again from whether expansion was smart to how much expansion was possible, from cautious leverage to aggressive growth strategies that assumed commodity prices would climb forever. Summer 1975 brought Timothy Moore back into Kate's orbit at the county fair, where she'd volunteered to manage the 4-H booth while Rachel showed her dairy cow. Timothy had been Jonathan's high school football coach years ago, a man who'd left teaching in 1972 when his wife died of cancer, and he'd inherited her family's farm. 280 acres in the next county over, run with the same quiet competence he'd brought to coaching teenagers who mostly didn't want to be coached. Kate Walker. He approached with a smile that seemed genuine rather than calculated. No hidden agenda in his expression. I heard you're farming now. How's it going? I'm surviving. Surviving's better than most people manage. Timothy leaned against the booth's wooden frame, surveying the fairgrounds with the easy stance of someone comfortable in his own skin. Half these folks are drowning in debt they don't talk about, putting on brave faces while the water rises. You're not. Nope. Learned from my dad, if you can't pay cash, you can't afford it. He laughed, and the sound carried no bitterness. Makes me the county cheapskate, but I sleep fine. Kate found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't around anyone since Drew died. Timothy asked about her operation, listened to her answers without trying to solve problems. She hadn't asked him to solve shared stories about his own struggles with equipment that refused to die despite everyone saying it should. The conversation flowed easy, two people speaking the same language in a world that increasingly seemed foreign. Would you want to grab coffee sometime? Compare notes on being the boring farmers everyone else laughs at. The invitation surprised Kate less than her own response. Yeah, I'd like that. Coffee became a weekly ritual through fall and winter. Two farmers sitting in a booth at the Main Street diner comparing crop yields and maintenance schedules and the particular loneliness of farming without partners. Timothy never pushed, never assumed that coffee meant anything beyond two people enjoying conversation. But Kate noticed how Rachel smiled when Timothy stopped by the farm to help fix a fence line, how even Kenneth seemed to approve of his presence. Spring 1976 brought Timothy to Kate's porch one evening in April sunset, turning the western sky purple and gold. He'd helped her with planting his own 280 already in the ground and lingered after the work was done. Kate, I've been thinking. His hands worked the brim of his cap, nervous energy, unusual for someone usually calm. My 280, your 160. That's 440 acres total. Perfect size for two people working together. We could combine operations, share equipment labor costs. Kate's defenses rose immediately automatic as breathing. Timothy, I'm not proposing marriage. Not yet, anyway. Just partnership. Business arrangement first. See how we work together. You'd keep your 160 separate in your name. I'd keep my 280 in mine. We'd just farm them as one unit. The offer was more reasonable than anything Kate had heard in years. No strings attached, no loss of ownership. Just two people pooling resources to achieve what neither could alone. And that reasonableness terrified her more than if Timothy had demanded something unreasonable, because reasonable offers required reasonable consideration, and Kate had built her survival on avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement. I need to think about it. Take all the time you need. Timothy settled his cap back on his head, preparing to leave. I'll still be here when you decide. Kate spent the next month thinking, calculating, weighing the practical benefits against the emotional costs of depending on someone else. Timothy never pressured, never asked for an answer, just kept showing up for coffee and conversation and occasional help with tasks that needed two people. But the offer hung between them, changing the nature of every interaction, transforming easy friendship into something weighted with possibility and expectation. She gave him her answer on a January evening in 1977, cold enough that words came out in visible clouds. Timothy had stopped by to check on Kenneth, who'd caught winter flu and spent 3 days in bed against his will. I can't do the partnership. Kate delivered the words quickly like ripping off a bandage. It's not about you. It's about me not being ready to trust anyone with my survival. Timothy absorbed this without visible reaction, just nodded once. I understand. Offer stands if you change your mind. He stopped visiting after that, their easy friendship a casualty of an offer made, and declined. Kate missed him more than she expected, missed the conversation, and the laughter, and the brief illusion that she might not have to carry everything alone. But missing him was easier than trusting him, and trust, real trust, of the kind that put your farm survival in someone else's hands, was a luxury Kate Walker couldn't afford. June 1977 arrived with heat that turned afternoon fieldwork into an endurance test. Jonathan had returned from Waterloo, his technical school degree completed, and 2 years of city work behind him. He'd decided farming was in his blood after all, had saved $4,000, and was talking about building a small house on the back 40, about proposing to his girlfriend Jessica, about a future that looked remarkably similar to the past Drew and Kate had built before death interrupted it. That Tuesday afternoon, Jonathan was dissing the north field with the John Deere 730, preparing ground for a late soybean planting. The field had a slope everyone in the family knew was tricky when the ground was soft from rain. Jonathan knew it too, had worked that field 100 times, but knowing didn't prevent the tractor's front end from lifting as he climbed the grade, didn't stop the weight shift that sent 850 pounds of machinery rolling sideways, didn't keep his right leg from being trapped under the fender when gravity finished what the slope had started. Rachel found him 20 minutes later, having come to bring water, and finding instead her brother pinned and conscious and trying very hard not to scream. She drove the Super M up beside the 730, used chains to pull it far enough off Jonathan that he could breathe, then drove like hell to the nearest phone to call an ambulance, while Kate ran from the house, having heard Rachel's truck engine screaming in ways that meant emergency. The hospital in the county seat smelled of disinfectant and fear. Jonathan in surgery, femur and tibia, both broken, compound ankle, crushed in ways the doctor said might never heal right. Kate sat in a waiting room designed to make people feel small and helpless. Kenneth beside her, saying nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Rachel pacing, because sitting still would mean accepting that her brother might lose the leg entirely if infection set in. The surgeon emerged after 4 hours, still in scrubs, exhaustion written across features, too young to look that tired. He'll walk again, months of physical therapy, extensive therapy, but he'll walk. Kate's relief lasted exactly as long as it took the administrator to arrive with paperwork about payment. The surgery alone was $5,800. Physical therapy would run another $4,000 to $6,000 over the next 8 months. Jonathan's farm work meant no employer insurance, no coverage, no safety net. Total out-of-pocket somewhere between $12,000 and $15,000. Kate's savings account held $25,000 accumulated through 5 years of careful deposits and desperate restraint. Giving Jonathan $12,000 would drop her to $13,000. One bad harvest away from being Jennifer Williams. One equipment breakdown away from needing the kind of loan she'd spent years avoiding. Kenneth found her in the hospital cafeteria at midnight, sitting alone with cold coffee, while Jonathan slept upstairs, drugged on painkillers that cost $3 per pill. The cafeteria was empty except for a janitor mopping floors and 2 nurses grabbing break-time coffee. Fluorescent lights made everyone look sick. Give him the money. If I give him $12,000, I have $13,000 left. 1 bad year, and I'm borrowing. Once I start borrowing, I'm on the same path that destroyed you in '58. He's your son. The farm is his inheritance. If I lose the farm, saving him now, what does he inherit except guilt? Kenneth's expression hardened in ways Kate had seen only a handful of times, the kind of cold fury that burned without heat. You're becoming what you hate, putting money before family. My mother said the same thing when I was drowning in debt. You made your bed, now lie in it. I didn't speak to her for 5 years. She died before we reconciled. You want that? Kate felt something crack inside her chest, some wall she'd built between survival and sentiment. What do I do? You give him the money. You take the risk. You trust that being careful for 5 years means you can afford one mistake, one emergency, one moment of choosing family over fear. The words settled into truth even as Kate's mind calculated the cost. She walked upstairs to Jonathan's room, where he lay conscious but foggy pain medication making his eyes unfocused. Rachel sat beside his bed, holding his good hand. I'm paying for everything. Surgery, therapy, whatever you need. Jonathan's voice came out thick and slurred. I'll pay you back. Every penny. Don't borrow for that house you want to build. Live in the farmhouse with Jessica until you've saved cash. Kate pulled a chair close, needing him to hear this clearly despite the drugs. Tell Jessica she can have new and debt or old and free, her choice. But I won't watch you repeat Kenneth's mistakes. The firmness in her voice surprised even her, sounding like Kenneth himself had somehow taken residence in her throat. Jonathan nodded, or tried to, then slipped back into medication-induced sleep. Kate sat with him until dawn, watching monitors beep and machines breathe for her son, understanding that she'd just sacrificed 5 years of security to buy an unknown future. Rachel contributed $2,000 from her veterinary clinic savings without being asked. Kate withdrew $10,000 from her account watching the balance drop to 15 and feeling physically ill. The administrator processed payment with the mechanical efficiency of someone who saw financial desperation daily and had learned to feel nothing about it. By fall 1977, Jonathan could walk with a cane, his limp pronounced but manageable. The physical therapy bills had climbed higher than estimated 14,000 total when everything was counted. Kate's savings sat at 13,000 lower than it had been since 1974. She'd lost 3 years of careful accumulation in 6 months of medical crisis, and the vulnerability of that position kept her awake most nights, calculating worst-case scenarios. But the markets kept climbing. Corn hit $4 per bushel by harvest 1977, pushing toward $4.50 by year's end. Land values followed dirt that had been worth $1,000 per acre, now bringing $1,500, $1,800, $2,000. The coffee shop conversations had transformed into something approaching religious fervor, farmers speaking of expansion and leverage and opportunity with the certainty of people who'd forgotten that markets could move in more than one direction. Christopher Martinez peaked at 1,600 acres total, having bought another 200 acres in late 1977. His equipment fleet was worth close to $400,000. New John Deere 8640 four-wheel drive articulated monster backup tractors, 2 combines, enough machinery to plant and harvest the entire operation without depending on anything. His estimated debt topped $800,000, but at current commodity prices, his annual gross income approached $550,000. Even with debt service eating $145,000 per year, he was netting over $100,000 after operating costs. The local paper ran another profile, this one calling him the agricultural entrepreneur of the decade. Pamela appeared in the photographs wearing clothes that probably cost what Kate spent on groceries annually, their ranch house visible in the background, now 4,000 square feet with a swimming pool and second garage. Their children drove BMWs to private school. The Martinez name had become synonymous with success, but Kate had started noticing cracks invisible to everyone else. Pamela at church, with hands that trembled, holding the hymnal, makeup applied heavier than before, covering dark circles that suggested sleepless nights, laughter that came too loud at jokes that weren't funny. Angela Young whispered over coffee that she'd seen empty wine bottles in the Martinez trash every week, quantities that suggested Pamela's drinking had moved from social to necessary. The Harvest Festival in October 1979 brought the entire county out to celebrate agricultural prosperity, a ritual of Thanksgiving that felt more like boasting. New equipment lined Main Street like a parade. Farmers who'd struggled 5 years earlier now discussed their second and third farms, their investment portfolios, their children's private school educations. The fever had become pandemic, and anyone who wasn't infected looked increasingly foolish. Kate attended because Kenneth insisted it was important to maintain community ties, but she positioned herself near exits and avoided conversations about expansion. The festival happened in the high school gymnasium, decorated with corn stalks and hay bales and enough food to feed 3 counties. Music played, children ran wild, and everyone performed the careful dance of appearing successful without admitting what that success had cost. She found Pamela in the bathroom alone and crying with mascara running black rivers down her face. The facade had finally cracked completely, no audience to perform for, no husband to maintain appearances beside. Kate's instinct was to leave, give the woman privacy for her breakdown, but something stronger pulled her forward, some recognition of shared experience that transcended years of subtle hostility. Pamela saw her and tried to compose herself, wiping at her face with hands that shook. "Go away." Kate didn't. She locked the bathroom door and handed Pamela paper towels from the dispenser. They stood there in harsh fluorescent light while party sounds filtered through walls, two women on opposite sides of a divide that was collapsing. "I can't do this anymore." Pamela's voice came raw and broken. The pretending, the smiling, the performing like everything's perfect when I wake up at 3 in the morning doing math in my head about what happens if prices drop, if drought hits, if interest rates rise. Have you told Christopher you're scared? He doesn't want a scared wife. He wants a partner who believes in the vision, who supports the expansion, who doesn't question whether we should own 1,600 acres or just the 400 we inherited. What do you want? The question seemed to catch Pamela off guard, like no one had asked her that in years or maybe ever. She met Kate's eyes in the mirror above the sink, seeing perhaps for the first time that Kate wasn't judging her, wasn't taking pleasure in her pain, was just offering the basic dignity of being seen. "I want to be you." Kate laughed before she could stop herself. "You want to be the town joke, the woman everyone pities. I want to sleep at night without medication. I want to stop being afraid every time the phone rings that it's the bank calling. I want to not owe anybody anything." Pamela's voice broke completely. "I want what you have the freedom to fail without taking 3 generations down with you. Then tell Christopher. I can't. If I do, he'll see me as weak, as not believing in what we're building. And maybe I am weak. Maybe I'm just a coward who married above her courage level. You're not weak. You're trapped. There's a difference." Pamela composed herself slowly, rebuilding the mask she'd need to walk back into the gymnasium and pretend her world wasn't disintegrating. "Thank you for not gloating. Why would I gloat? Watching you suffer doesn't make me more successful. It just means we're both struggling, just in different ways." The words hung between them, honest and raw, before Pamela walked out, leaving Kate alone, with the understanding that the roles had reversed without anyone announcing it. Pamela had become the object of pity, the cautionary tale, the example of what happened when you built your life on borrowed certainty. Kate's own position by year's end, 1979, looked modest but stable. Savings had rebuilt to $19,000 after Jonathan's expenses, still below the $25,000 peak, but climbing. 160 acres producing consistent yields at prices that kept climbing meant she'd cleared $15,000 that year after all costs. The Super M and John Deere 730 kept running, maintained obsessively because she couldn't afford for them to fail. No debt except the seasonal operating loan paid off same year. No leverage, but no noose either. The new decade arrived with headlines about inflation and interest rates and Federal Reserve policies Kate only partially understood. What she did understand was that money had started costing more to borrow, that the easy credit fueling expansion was showing signs of tightening, that the party everyone had assumed would last forever was starting to show symptoms of a hangover no one wanted to acknowledge. January 1980 brought the announcement over breakfast radio. Kate, standing at the kitchen sink with coffee cooling in her hands, while a voice explained that President Carter had ordered a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their Afghanistan invasion. The words were diplomatic and measured, delivered with the gravity of geopolitical necessity. Kate heard only the sound of markets collapsing before they'd even opened. Kenneth walked in from the barn to find her still standing there, coffee forgotten, radio continuing to explain what the embargo meant for American agriculture. "You hear, I heard. Corn at $4.85 is done. We'll be lucky to see $2.85 by June. How fast? Fast enough that anyone depending on high prices to service debt is already underwater. They just don't know it yet." The market proved Kenneth right within weeks. Corn dropped to $4.20 in January, $3.80 by February, $3.20 by March. The coffee shop conversations transformed overnight from expansion strategies to survival tactics, from confident projections to desperate calculations. Men who'd seemed invincible 6 months earlier now carried the shell-shocked expressions of soldiers after unexpected ambush. Christopher Martinez stopped holding court, stopped offering theories about the new agricultural economy. He sat in corners, nursing coffee, gone cold, dark circles under his eyes, suggesting sleep had become another luxury he couldn't afford. Gary Thompson whispered to Kate one morning that Christopher's debt service had been calculated on $4.50 corn. At $2.85, the mathematics went from profitable to catastrophic. Christopher's operation needed to gross $500,000 minimum to cover debt service and operating costs. 1,600 acres times 130 bushels per acre times 450 equaled just over 900,000 gross, leaving comfortable room for debt payments and living expenses. But at $2.85, that same yield generated only 590,000 gross. Subtract 320,000 in operating costs and 145,000 in debt service, and Christopher Martinez was losing money with every bushel he harvested. One bad year was survivable if the next year recovered. But spring 1980 brought something worse than low prices. It brought drought. April passed with scattered showers that barely dampened topsoil. May delivered heat waves that felt wrong for spring temperatures in the 90s that sucked moisture from soil faster than corn could use it. By June, the young plants showed stress leaves curling inward during the hottest part of the day, like hands closing against pain. Kate walked her fields in evening light, running hands over corn that should have been knee-high and vigorous, but instead stood stunted and pale. Her costs were low enough that even poor yields wouldn't destroy her, but for farmers carrying heavy debt and counting on maximum production, this drought was mathematical execution. Christopher Martinez's massive irrigation system sat idle. He'd installed it in 1978 at enormous expense, counting on it to guarantee yields, regardless of weather. But irrigation required fuel, and fuel prices had followed everything else into the stratosphere. Running pumps to water 1,600 acres would cost more than the increased yield was worth at current grain prices. So the irrigation sat unused while crops died and debt compounded, and Christopher watched his empire dehydrate acre by expensive acre. Kenneth's health had been declining in ways he refused to acknowledge. Small signs Kate noticed, but couldn't force him to address. Shortness of breath after minimal exertion, stumbling over words that used to come easy, hands that trembled when he thought no one was watching. He was 70 years old and farming like he was 40, trying to help Kate compensate for Jonathan's lingering limitations. The stroke came on a September morning, Kate finding him collapsed in the barn, conscious but unable to move his right side, words slurred into incomprehensibility. "Don't. Call. I'm calling an ambulance." Kate was already running for the phone in the equipment shed. "Stop being stubborn like you," even mid-stroke. Kenneth managed to point out irony. The ambulance took 20 minutes to arrive. 20 minutes Kate spent holding Kenneth's hand and watching his eyes track her movements with perfect clarity, even while his body refused basic commands. The hospital kept him for 2 weeks. Major stroke, the doctors explained. Right side paralysis. Months of rehabilitation required. Prognosis uncertain. At 70, recovery would be slow and incomplete. He'd need care, supervision, assistance with daily tasks that would have humiliated him if he'd been capable of feeling humiliation through the fog of medication. Kate sat beside his hospital bed while machines beeped and nurses checked vitals and Kenneth drifted in and out of consciousness. Her support system had collapsed to rubble. Kenneth couldn't help anymore. Jonathan could manage some tasks, but remained limited. Rachel was finishing her final year at Iowa State. Timothy Moore had offered help once, and Kate had declined, and you didn't get second chances at grace, you'd rejected the first time. She was alone now, in ways that went beyond Drew's death, beyond Kenneth's stroke, beyond any single loss. Alone with 160 acres that needed tending, and equipment that needed maintaining, and a future that required her to be perfect, because there was no room left for mistakes. One night in the hospital, after Kenneth had fallen asleep, and the nurses had dimmed lights for evening rounds, Kate sat in the vinyl chair beside his bed and let herself break. Not crying exactly, just a quiet dissolution of the armor she'd maintained for 9 years. The Super M was 30 years old. The John Deere 730 was 25. She was 52 and exhausted in ways sleep couldn't fix. The farm demanded perfection, and she had nothing left to give except the same careful calculations and desperate maintenance that had gotten her this far. "I can't do this." The words came out whisper quiet, more admission than prayer. Everyone was right. A woman can't handle this alone. But even as she spoke the words, Kate knew she'd keep trying. Because trying was all she had left, and surrender meant proving right. Everyone who'd bet against her meant validating every skeptic and condescending banker and farmer who'd used her name as a cautionary tale. Surrender meant Jennifer Williams serving chicken nuggets to children who pitied her. Kate Walker would be hungry before she'd be pitied, would work herself to exhaustion before admitting defeat, would farm with 30-year-old equipment and sleep 4 hours a night and calculate budgets by candlelight if necessary, because the alternative was selling 160 acres that belonged to her and no one else, that carried Drew's memory in every furrow, that represented 9 years of work so relentless it had nearly killed her. The drought continued through October, yields coming in at 65 bushels per acre across the county. Kate's 160 acres produced 10,400 bushels total. At $2.65 per bushel, that meant gross income of $27,560. Operating costs $14,000. That left $13,560 profit in a year when most farmers lost money. Christopher Martinez's 1,600 acres at the same yield generated 104,000 bushels. At $2.65, that was 275,600 gross. operating costs of $320,000 plus debt service that had climbed to $178,000 at 21% interest meant Christopher needed $498,000 to break even. His shortfall topped $220,000 a hole, so deep that selling equipment barely made a dent. The Warren County Register started running foreclosure notices by November. Small operations, first young farmers who'd bought in at market peak and couldn't service debt when prices collapsed. But the notices multiplied through December, 3, then 5, then 8, then 12. Names Kate recognized families she'd known for decades, farmers who'd done everything the experts said to do, and discovered that expertise was just another word for shared delusion. Kate sat at her kitchen table on New Year's Eve, 1980, account ledger spread open, showing savings of $19,000 minus $8,000 for Kenneth's hospital bills, $11,000 left. One more crisis away from being back where she'd started. The Super M needed a clutch rebuild that would cost $1,200. The 730 was making concerning noises, suggesting transmission problems. The farmhouse roof had developed 3 new leaks. Equipment that had seemed reliable now felt like it was held together with rust and prayer. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, Christopher Martinez was probably running the same calculations and arriving at very different conclusions. His empire was disintegrating one foreclosure notice away from public humiliation. Pamela's nightmare had arrived wearing the mask of economic reality, proving that fear was sometimes just prescience that couldn't prevent what it predicted. Kate closed the ledger and walked to the window, looking out at frozen fields that would need planting in 4 months. The question Kenneth had asked years ago remained unanswered. Was she wise or just lucky? Had caution saved her, or had she simply not been tested yet? The answer wouldn't matter until the testing was complete, and Kate suspected the real test was just beginning. Spring 1981 arrived with the kind of optimism only farmers could muster, planting into ground that felt like ash and praying for rain that meteorologists said would come eventually. Kate dropped seed with the Super M, its 30-year-old engine running rough but serviceable each pass across her 160 acres, feeling less like farming and more like an act of faith bordering on delusion. The rain came sporadic and insufficient enough to germinate seed, but not enough to sustain growth through summer heat that returned with vengeance. Corn emerged weak and stayed that way, leaves yellowing by June when they should have been dark green and vigorous. Kate walked her fields, calculating yield projections that dropped week by week, 75 bushels per acre if she was lucky, 60 if the rain didn't come soon. The Warren County Register had become required reading for reasons no one wanted to admit. Foreclosure notices that had occupied a quarter page in January consumed half a page by March, 3/4 by June. Names Kate recognized appeared weekly. Now, farmers who'd expanded during boom years borrowed against land that was worth half what they'd paid, planted crops that couldn't generate enough revenue to service debt, even if yields had been perfect. Gary Thompson's foreclosure notice appeared in July, 800 acres and $200,000 in debt he couldn't cover. Kate attended the auction more from obligation than interest, watching neighbors pick through Gary's equipment like vultures on roadkill. Donna Thompson stood near the house crying while strangers cataloged her life into lot numbers and reserve prices. The coffee shop had transformed from gathering place to funeral home, farmers sitting in silence over coffee they couldn't taste, performing the ritual of normalcy while their worlds disintegrated. Christopher Martinez no longer attended at all, his absence somehow louder than his previous presence had been. Larry Young reported seeing Christopher's equipment for sale through private dealers' quiet liquidation before the bank-forced public auction. Timothy Moore appeared at Kate's farm one October morning, his truck pulling a grain wagon she hadn't requested. "I'm helping 2 days a week through harvest, not asking permission." Kate stood in her farmyard pride, warring with desperation. "Timothy, I can't pay. Not asking for payment. Being a neighbor, that's what neighbors do when neighbors need help." He climbed out of his truck and started checking her combine testing chains and inspecting bearings like he'd been part of her operation all along. Kate watched him work, understanding that sometimes grace arrived without permission, and refusing it became its own kind of arrogance. Harvest. 1981 brought yields of 78 bushels per acre, better than expected, but still 40% below normal. Prices had stabilized around $250, not climbing, but at least not collapsing further. Kate's gross income topped $20,000 after costs enough to survive, but not enough to rebuild savings depleted by Kenneth's medical bills and equipment repairs that kept multiplying. Kenneth had recovered enough to sit in a wheelchair and offer advice, his speech still slurred, but his mind sharp as ever. He watched Timothy help Kate maintain equipment, watched her accept assistance she'd refused 2 years earlier, and said nothing, because sometimes silence was the only approval that mattered. Jonathan had married Jessica in a ceremony so modest it barely qualified as a wedding. 30 people in the courthouse and dinner at the farmhouse afterward. They lived in the old house Kate had shared with Drew, saving money because Jonathan had learned what debt cost by watching his mother sacrifice her security to save his leg. He worked the farm when his body allowed supplemented income with weekend construction jobs, and never once suggested Kate should sell or modernize or do anything except what made sense to her. Rachel graduated from Iowa State in May 1982. Doctor of Veterinary Medicine, earned through scholarships and part-time work and student loans she insisted on taking despite Kate's protests. She'd accepted a position in Kansas City, good pay, and better opportunities than Warren County could offer. Kate had held her daughter on graduation day and whispered what Drew would have said, "Build something that's yours." The Martinez foreclosure notice appeared in the Register on a Tuesday in April 1982, cold and official. Public auction. Martinez Family Farms, 1,600 acres. Equipment, livestock, grain, inventory, June 15, 1982, 10 a.m. by order of farmers. State Bank. The notice occupied a full quarter page larger than any foreclosure announcement Kate had seen. 1,600 acres, $850,000 in estimated debt. Equipment worth maybe $200,000 at fire sale prices. Land that had been valued at $3,000 per acre in 1979, now bringing $1,200 if you were lucky. The mathematics of Christopher Martinez's collapse were a public record. Now his empire reduced to lot numbers and auction terms. Kate marked the date on her kitchen calendar, understanding she would attend not from satisfaction, but from recognition that this moment divided time into before and after. The boom had officially ended. The bust had officially begun, and everyone who'd called her foolish for staying small would gather to watch proof that foolish and wise were just different names for the same caution depending on which way the wind blew. The weeks leading to auction brought rumors that spread like infection. Christopher had taken a job at the feed mill, making $9 per hour. Pamela had stopped leaving the house entirely, groceries delivered by her father's secretary, because she couldn't face public encounters. Brandon Martinez had dropped out of college, working construction, to help his parents pay rent on the modest house they'd moved to in town. The family who'd represented agricultural success now represented its opposite, their fall so complete it felt biblical. Kate saw Pamela once, during those weeks, accidentally at the grocery store on a Wednesday afternoon when most farmers were in fields. Pamela looked diminished, somehow wearing jeans that had seen better days and a sweatshirt that might have belonged to Christopher. No makeup, hair pulled back without care, eyes that couldn't quite focus on anything directly. Their carts nearly collided in the canned goods aisle. Pamela saw Kate and froze like prey before predator. "I'm not here to judge." Pamela's laugh came bitter. "Everyone's here to judge. That's what happens when you fail as publicly as we failed." Kate reached out, touched Pamela's arm, felt the woman flinch, like touch itself had become painful. "I'm sorry this happened." "Don't be." Pamela's voice carried no emotion, just exhausted acceptance. "You warned us." "I warned Christopher. We just couldn't hear it over the sound of our own certainty." She walked away, leaving her cart half full in the middle of the aisle, and Kate understood that some pain went too deep for grocery shopping, too deep for the performance of normalcy that daily life required. June 15th arrived cold for summer temperature, hovering in the high 40s with clouds threatening rain that would make the auction miserable for everyone except the auctioneer, who got paid regardless. Kate drove to the Martinez farm, with Kenneth in the passenger seat, his wheelchair folded in the truck bed, both of them silent, because there was nothing useful to say about bearing witness to someone else's catastrophe. The crowd was smaller than Herman Vogel's auction 9 years earlier, fewer bidders because fewer people had money, and most who did were scared to spend it. Mostly witnesses farmers who'd survived through luck or caution or some combination, coming to watch the ritual sacrifice that made their own survival feel earned rather than accidental. Christopher and Pamela stood near the equipment shed, both looking like they'd aged a decade in 18 months. Christopher had lost probably 40 pounds, his face hollowed out by stress and sleepless nights. Pamela stood close to him, not touching, but present, and Kate noticed her hands didn't shake anymore. Whatever Pamela had been drinking to cope with fear, she'd apparently stopped now that the fear had been realized and proven survivable. The auctioneer from Des Moines worked efficiently through equipment inventory, his voice carrying practiced indifference to the human cost of each lot sold. The IH-1 466 that Christopher had been so proud of brought $18,060 loss from purchase price. The big John Deere 8640 articulated tractor went for $38,000 massive loss, but at least it brought something. Combines, planters, grain bins, everything sold for fractions, the crowd bearing witness to wealth evaporating into mathematics. Kate didn't bid. She had no use for equipment scaled to 1,600 acres. No money for purchases that would sit idle, no desire to profit from Christopher's failure. But, near the end, they brought out a gravity wagon with wooden sides, something old enough that Christopher had probably inherited it and forgotten he owned it. "Who'll give me 100?" The auctioneer's voice carried exhaustion now, hours into the process, the cold having seeped through everyone's defenses. 50. Kate's voice surprised her as much as anyone else. "I've got 50 from the lady in back." 60. Anyone. Silence. Nobody wanted a wooden wagon in an era of steel bins and modern grain handling. Sold for $50. Kate walked to the clerk's table and counted exact bills, aware of Christopher watching her, aware of the crowd's judgment about what that purchase meant. She'd bought the wagon not because she needed it, but because leaving without purchasing something felt like spectating on tragedy without acknowledging her own proximity to the same fate. The land parcels sold inside the house, only serious buyers with pre-qualified financing invited. Kate stayed in the yard, watching through windows as her farm's future got decided by people who'd survived by being slightly less ambitious or slightly more lucky than Christopher Martinez. When the auction ended, when the crowd dispersed to trucks, and the equipment haulers started loading purchases, Kate found Christopher standing alone behind the barn. The same spot where she'd found Pamela crying at the Harvest Festival, some magnetic property of that location pulling broken people into its gravity. "Mr. Martinez," he turned, and Kate saw that he'd been crying, though he'd wiped the evidence away. "Mrs. Walker, come to see it all laid out for sale, came to pay respects." Christopher's laugh held no humor. "Respects are for the dead. I'm just bankrupt." The distinction seemed important to him, this insistence that financial death wasn't actual death, that he could survive the loss of everything except life itself. Kate sat down on the cold ground beside him, ignoring the mud and the temperature, and the way sitting made her joints protest. "What will you do? I don't know. The feed mill job pays $9 an hour. Pamela's father won't speak to us, says we embarrassed him. Brandon dropped out of school to work construction. We're renting a house for $175 a month that we can barely afford." He stopped, voice breaking, then continued, "I want you to know what Pamela said to you over the years, the way she talked down to you at church and social events. I should have stopped it. Water under bridges. No, it's not." Christopher met her eyes directly for the first time. "You tried to tell us, not with words, but just by being you, staying small, avoiding debt. We mocked you for it, called you timid and outdated and too scared to succeed. You believed in a different path. I believed in mine. We believed in lies wrapped in economic theory and bank presentations." Christopher's composure cracked completely, tears coming despite his efforts to prevent them. 12 years building something I thought would last generations. Gone in 18 months. My kids won't inherit a farm. That's on me. All of it. He stood abruptly, walking away, before Kate could formulate a response. She sat there, in the mud, watching him disappear around the barn, understanding that some lessons could only be taught through complete destruction, that Christopher Martinez had paid tuition in the most expensive school that existed. The Peterson 80 acres north of Kate's farm had been part of the Martinez portfolio, purchased during expansion years and now reverting to Farmers State Bank. Kate had calculated she could offer $100,000 cash for the parcel, having rebuilt savings to $45,000 and believing she could scrape together the rest through selling cattle or borrowing against her own land if absolutely necessary. But borrowing violated every principle she'd maintained, and selling cattle meant sacrificing future income, and the whole calculation felt like the first step toward becoming what she'd avoided. So Kate decided to wait, to keep saving, to let someone else buy the Peterson place if they wanted it badly enough. Timothy Moore found her 3 days after the auction sitting on her porch and watching sunset turn the western sky colors that promised weather. He climbed out of his truck, carrying an envelope, his expression unreadable. "I bought the Peterson 80. Kate's stomach dropped. "Congratulations." "Don't congratulate me yet." Timothy handed her the envelope. "I bought it for you." Inside was a deed transfer agreement. The Peterson 80 acres being sold from Timothy Moore to Catherine Walker for $100,000, payment terms listed as cash payment whenever purchaser has funds available. No interest, no deadline. Kate stared at the paperwork, trying to process what she was reading. "Timothy, I can't accept this. You're not accepting a gift. You're accepting a sale on terms that make sense for both of us." He settled against the porch railing, calm as always. "You need that land to keep your operation viable. You can't get bank financing without jumping through hoops designed for men. I have cash from selling my mother's estate, so I'm offering you a loan that doesn't come from Ronald Anderson or anyone who'll use it as leverage over you. This is too much. If I can't pay, you'll pay. Might take 5 years, might take 10. Doesn't matter. I'll get my money back, and you'll get your land without selling your soul to a bank that's already proven they don't want women farmers succeeding." "Why would you do this?" Timothy's expression softened into something that looked like affection mixed with respect. "Because 2 years ago you turned down my partnership offer. You were right till you needed to prove you could make it alone. You proved it. But now you need to expand to survive, and you can't do it with traditional financing. So I'm offering different terms. Trust instead of interest." Kate felt tears threatening, fought them back through will that had carried her through 9 years of isolation and struggle. "How do I know you won't use this against me?" "You don't." Timothy's honesty was brutal and clean. "You're taking a risk, trusting me the same way I'm taking a risk trusting you. But we've both been farming long enough to know that trust is the only currency that works when money stops making sense." She signed the papers that evening, her hand shaking slightly as she wrote her name on documents that gave her 240 acres total, doubled her operation, and put her in debt to a man who'd offered marriage once and been refused. The mathematics of it terrified her. Owing $100,000 to anyone, even someone as decent as Timothy, meant vulnerability she'd spent a decade avoiding. But the alternative was staying at 160, watching equipment age past viability, surviving in an industry that was slowly eliminating anyone who couldn't achieve minimum scale. Timothy's offer wasn't charity. It was a bridge across a gap Kate couldn't jump alone, and refusing it would be pride masquerading as principle. The following week brought Pamela Martinez to Kate's farm, driving a car so old it barely qualified as transportation. She climbed out, wearing what were obviously Christopher's work clothes, too large, and adjusted with a belt, her appearance so changed from the country club version that Kate almost didn't recognize her. "I need to talk to you." They walked to the cemetery behind the property line, the same space where Pamela had confessed her fears 3 years earlier. But this Pamela was different. No mask, no performance, just exhaustion and something that looked almost like peace. "Christopher and I are separating. Not divorcing yet, but living apart. I'm staying with my sister in Des Moines while we figure out what's next. I'm sorry. Don't be. Pamela's voice carried no bitterness, just tired acceptance. We spent 15 years building something neither of us wanted. He wanted to prove he was smarter than everyone else. I wanted to prove I was more than Ronald Anderson's daughter. We achieved our goals by destroying everything that mattered. The words settled between them, honest and raw. Kate waited, understanding that Pamela needed to speak more than she needed responses. I came to apologize for every condescending comment at church, every pitying look at your equipment, every subtle dig about your clothes or your truck or your choices. Pamela met Kate's eyes directly. You were free, and I was trapped, and I hated you for having what I wanted. So I tried to make you feel small, to make myself feel big. You were scared. Fear makes people cruel. It does. But that doesn't excuse it. Pamela pulled a folded paper from her pocket. I wrote down everything I remember saying to you that was cruel or condescending. 3 pages worth. I'm not asking you to read it or forgive me. I just wanted you to know I remembered, and I'm ashamed. Kate took the paper, felt its weight, literal and metaphorical, and understood that this apology cost Pamela more than any auction had cost Christopher. Forgiveness is cheaper than carrying grudges. I forgive you. Pamela broke, then tears coming silent and complete. Kate held her while she cried. 2 women who'd been on opposite sides of every divide that mattered, discovering that the divides themselves had been illusions maintained by fear and pride, and the desperate performance of certainty neither had actually possessed. When Pamela composed herself, she asked the question Kate had been expecting. What do I do now? I'm 38 years old, and I've never worked a real job, never supported myself, never been just Pamela instead of somebody's daughter or somebody's wife. You learn, one day at a time. You figure out who you are when nobody's watching, and nothing depends on the performance. That's not much of a plan. It's the only plan that works when everything else falls apart. They walked back to the farmyard where Pamela's borrowed car waited. Before leaving, Pamela turned back. If you ever need help with anything, and I know I have no right to offer this after everything I can work. I don't know farming, but I can learn other things. Kate had been thinking about this, calculating whether mercy was just another form of foolishness, or if sometimes foolishness was indistinguishable from grace. I run a farm stand in summers. Vegetables, eggs, honey. Doesn't pay much, but it's honest work. Pamela's expression transformed something like hope, breaking through exhaustion. When do I start? Soon as you're ready. After she left, Kate stood in her farmyard, understanding that she'd just hired the woman who'd spent years making her feel inadequate, who'd represented everything Kate couldn't have and probably shouldn't want. But Pamela wasn't that woman anymore, had been stripped down to essential humanity by the same forces that had tested Kate, and refusing to help would be cruelty disguised as justice. Christopher Martinez appeared at Kate's farm on a Saturday in late June, driving a truck that belonged to his employer and wearing clothes that smelled of feed mill dust. He stood in her farmyard looking diminished, not just physically, but existentially, a man who'd lost the certainty that had defined him. Mrs. Walker, I don't have any right to ask you this. Kate waited, letting him work toward whatever he'd come to say. I need work. Farm work. I'm good at it. It's the only thing I've ever been good at. The feed mill pays bills, but it's killing me, being inside all day, mixing rations instead of being in fields. I heard you bought the Peterson 80. That's $240 total. You'll need help. The request hung between them, heavy with implications. Christopher Martinez asking Kate Walker for employment, the man who'd represented modern agriculture begging for a job from the woman he'd considered obsolete. I can't pay much. Kate delivered the words carefully, wanting him to understand the terms before agreeing. I'm offering partnership, 50-50 ownership after 5 years if you want it. Until then, we split profits equally. You work with me, farming both places. No loans, no debt, just labor. Why would you do that? Because that land deserves to be farmed right. Because you know how to farm when you're not trying to build empires. Because losing your farm doesn't mean you stop being a farmer. Christopher's throat worked, emotion threatening to break through the control he was desperately maintaining. What about Pamela? She's already working for me. Farm stand starts next month. You hired my wife before you hired me? Kate almost smiled. I hired a woman who needed work and knows how to make things look professional. Whether she's your wife is between you two. Christopher extended his hand, and Kate shook it, sealing an agreement that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The town would talk was probably already talking about Kate Walker partnering with the man who'd represented everything she'd rejected. But the talking didn't matter anymore, had never mattered as much as Kate had let herself believe. What mattered was that 240 acres needed tending equipment, needed maintaining, and doing it alone had nearly killed her. Christopher knew the Peterson land better than anyone understood its drainage and soil composition and particular quirks. Hiring him made practical sense, and if it also offered redemption to a man who'd learned expensive lessons, that was just mathematics working in everyone's favor. Summer 1982 brought the partnership into being. Kate and Christopher farming together with a wariness that slowly transformed into something resembling trust. He knew equipment maintenance she'd never learned, understood modern planting techniques she'd avoided, brought skills earned through years of operating large-scale farms. She knew conservative budgeting he'd never practiced, understood the mathematics of survival versus growth, brought wisdom earned through years of refusing to expand beyond her means. They worked dawn to dark. Timothy Moore helping 2 days weekly, as promised, Kenneth advising from his wheelchair when his speech allowed. The farm began functioning like Kate had imagined it could if she'd had help 240 acres planted efficiently. Equipment maintained properly, decisions made through discussion rather than desperate calculation. Pamela's farm stand opened in July, a modest table under a canopy selling vegetables and eggs Kate's chickens produced. Pamela treated it like a corporate project, designing signs and pricing structures and customer service protocols that turned a simple farm stand into something approaching professional. She worked 6 days weekly for minimum wage, saving every penny, and rebuilding an identity that wasn't based on whose daughter or wife she was. Rachel visited in August, bringing her new veterinarian confidence and stories about Kansas City practice that made Kate simultaneously proud and lonely. They sat on the porch after dinner, watching fireflies and listening to summer sounds. You partnered with Christopher Martinez. Mom, that's either brilliant or insane. Ask me in 5 years which it was. Rachel smiled, the expression carrying Drew's mischief and Kate's determination. "You're different. Lighter somehow. I'm sharing the weight instead of carrying it alone." Turns out that changes everything. The fall harvest brought yields of 90 bushels per acre, recovery from drought years, prices stabilizing around $3. Kate and Christopher's combined operation grossed approximately $55,000 after all costs split equally. $27,500 was more money than Kate had cleared in any single year, enough to pay Timothy $15,000 toward the Peterson land rebuild savings, maintain equipment, and still have cushion for winter. Christopher took his share and paid rent, bought clothes for his kids, sent Brandon back to college. He and Pamela were attempting reconciliation, attending counseling that Ronald Anderson's money couldn't buy, but his insurance somehow covered. Their future remained uncertain, but uncertainty was better than the false certainty that had destroyed them. Kenneth died in November, peacefully, in his sleep, having witnessed Kate's partnership succeed enough to believe she'd survive whatever came next. The funeral was small, just family and neighbors who remembered him from before farming had changed into something he barely recognized. They buried him beside Drew in the cemetery behind the church, 2 generations of farmers who'd understood that owning land mattered more than appearing successful. Kate stood at the graveside, understanding that Kenneth's lessons debt is a rope that looks like a ladder. Careful isn't the same as cheap pride is expensive, had saved her when every expert and banker and modern farmer had said she was wrong. She'd been too scared to succeed by their metrics, but fear had kept her solvent when confidence destroyed everyone around her. Winter brought planning for 1983. Kate and Christopher, sitting at her kitchen table, calculating seed rates and fertilizer costs and equipment needs. The partnership was working not perfectly, but functionally. 2 people who'd approached farming from opposite directions, discovering that the middle path combined the best of both extremes. Spring planting happened efficiently with 2 tractors and 2 operators, the Super M still running at 32 years old, pulling its weight beside Christopher's newer equipment, like proof that old and new could coexist. If you stop demanding one, eliminate the other. Kate drove her ancient tractor across fields that now belonged partially to her and partially to Timothy, and would eventually belong partially to Christopher, understanding that ownership was more complicated than deeds suggested, but no less real. By 1987, 5 years into the partnership, the farm had become something neither Kate nor Christopher could have built alone. 240 acres producing consistently equipment, well-maintained debts, manageable. Kate had paid Timothy the full $100,000, the last check handed over at a coffee shop, where he'd smiled and said what he'd known all along, that she was good for it, and the trust had been worth more than the interest any bank would have charged. Christopher and Pamela had reconciled fully. Their marriage, rebuilt on honesty about fear and failure rather than performance of success. They lived modestly in town, their kids understanding that the ranch house and swimming pool and private schools had been borrowed prosperity they'd confused with actual wealth. Brandon farmed a small 80-acre plot using Kate's methods. No debt, old equipment, conservative growth. The lessons had been expensive, but they'd taken root. The farm stand had expanded under Pamela's management, now including Kate's produce, plus honey from local beekeepers and preserves from Donna Thompson, who'd needed income after Gary's foreclosure. It generated enough revenue to employ Pamela full-time at above minimum wage, giving her financial independence she'd never possessed despite all her father's money. Timothy Moore had finally received the answer he'd waited for Kate, accepting his marriage proposal on the condition that they maintain separate farms for 1 more year, just to prove she could. The wedding was scheduled for fall, small ceremony, planned nothing fancy, because fancy had never been the point. Kate Walker stood in her north field on a spring evening in 1987, watching the Super M pull a planter across ground that had tested her for 16 years. The tractor was 36 years old, now maintained obsessively, still functional, despite everyone saying it should have been replaced decades ago. Like Kate herself, it had survived through being too stubborn to quit and too practical to believe the promises everyone else had fallen for. A young widow approached across the field, someone Kate recognized from another farm auction that had happened last week. Another foreclosure, another family losing everything to debt they'd believed would work out somehow. The widow looked lost, standing at field's edge, watching Kate work. "Mrs. Walker, I'm Sarah Chen. People said I should talk to you." Kate shut down. The Usuperum climbed off the steel seat that had held her through years of doubt and determination. "What did people say? That you've been where I am, that you know how to survive when everyone says it's impossible?" Kate looked at this woman, early 30s, probably wearing the shell-shocked expression of someone whose world had ended and who couldn't comprehend what came next. "I'm not sure I know anything except that fear is sometimes smarter than confidence. They said you farmed with old equipment and no debt while everyone else expanded. They said people mocked you for being too conservative. Then the bust came and you were the only one left standing. I wasn't the only one, just one of the few." Kate gestured toward the Super M, toward fields that had seen failure and survival in equal measure. "I survived by being too scared to do anything except what made sense to me." Sometimes fear is just wisdom wearing work clothes. Sarah nodded, absorbing this. "Will you teach me how to do it your way?" Kate considered the question, thought about Kenneth teaching Drew, Drew teaching her teaching Christopher and Pamela and Brandon and everyone else who'd been willing to learn lessons that only came through choosing survival over success. "I'll teach you what I know. Whether it works for you depends on whether you can live with being called foolish until foolish starts looking like wisdom." They walked toward the farmhouse where Christopher was checking equipment and Pamela was preparing dinner and Timothy's truck was pulling into the driveway. Kate understood that she'd become what she'd needed 16 years ago, someone who'd survived to tell the truth about what survival actually cost and whether the price was worth paying. The truth was simple and brutal. You couldn't control markets or weather or other people's certainty that you were wrong. You could only control whether you owned your failures or whether your failures owned you. Kate had chosen ownership, had accepted being poor and mocked and considered obsolete because ownership was the only thing that couldn't be taken away when everything else collapsed. The Super M sat at field's edge, engine cooling in evening air, 36 years old and still working, because working was all it knew how to do. Like the tractor, like the farm, like Kate herself, survival wasn't about being the biggest or fastest or most modern. Survival was about still being there when everyone else had fallen away, about understanding that the difference between a rope and a ladder was just perspective and timing, and whether you were still standing when gravity finally explained which was which. Kate Walker had been called foolish for 16 years. She'd watched neighbors grow wealthy on borrowed certainty. She'd been pitied and dismissed and used as a cautionary tale about what happened when you thought small, in an era demanding bigness. But standing there in her field with Sarah Chen asking to learn what she knew, Kate finally understood what Kenneth had been trying to teach all along. Wisdom and foolishness were the same choice wearing different outcomes. The choice itself never changed, just whether you survived long enough to be vindicated or failed quickly enough to be forgotten. Kate had survived. The vindication was just mathematics proving what fear had always known, that debt was a rope that looked like a ladder until you were hanging from it. That careful and cheap were different words for the same freedom that sleeping at night without owing anyone anything was worth more than any amount of borrowed prosperity. The farm would still be here tomorrow. The Super M would still run. Kate Walker would still wake before dawn to tend land that belonged to her and Timothy, and partially to Christopher, and completely to the generations who would inherit not just acres, but the understanding that survival sometimes required looking foolish until circumstances revealed that foolish had been wise all along. She'd been too scared to succeed by everyone else's metrics, but fear had saved her when confidence destroyed everyone around her, and now she could offer that salvation to someone else, standing where she'd stood, asking the same questions she'd asked, needing the same answers she'd needed, that being afraid wasn't weakness if the fear kept you from falling off ladders that were really just ropes wearing disguises until the height revealed their true nature.